Okie dokie, everybody. Well, let's get started with this new unit that we're starting with today, which is the Industrial Revolution. We can't waste a single solitary minute in this class. We've got to just keep on moving on. So, um, let's. Let me make sure that I have the PowerPoint up here real quick. Okay, so I just uploaded the PowerPoint to Canvas. If you want to check that out, you're welcome to, but it will be up on the screen when I start lecturing here in just a second. I will be grading the French Revolution tests probably later today-ish. And putting those into the grade books, so keep an eye out for that. Don't worry too much about the DBQ for right now because I know that you guys we're still kind of new at DBQs and stuff, but we're gonna do some. I just want to use the class time to get going with Industrial Revolution because I don't want to get further behind. So rather than using class time to talk about your DBQs, I'll see if I can provide some feedback to you on Canvas that will help put you in the right direction of like what your thing is missing or what you need to change or how you need to fix it. So just be on the lookout for that. But grading writing takes me a long time. So, sorry, I've got hair in my mouth. But just, be patient. I'll get you some feedback on those, but remember, I'm not making it part of your test grade. Those DBQs will be a separate like practice assignment or whatever. I didn't feel comfortable giving you a DBQ as a graded portion of your test yet because I know that we've only done a handful of them. So, okay. Let me pop this over to my desktop. And that's the Napoleon one. We need this one right here. Okay. And let me close that. And I'll move this over here. And am I on my desktop? Yes, I am. Widen that out a little bit. Okay. So, we are talking about the Industrial Revolution in Britain. In particular in Britain because Britain is the first place in the world to begin industrializing. And it happens in an age in Britain in the 1800s, which is typically termed the Victorian Age. Now, if we look up Queen Victoria, who was one of the longest serving queens in English history, okay? Now, her reign was recently eclipsed, maybe about 10 years ago, by Elizabeth II, the current Queen of England, who, as you may or may not know, is into her 90s. She is quite elderly, and but she looks fantastic for her age, and and she has lived a very long time and served as Queen of England for a really long time. But one of the things to remember, of course, about modern day queens or kings of England is that they have a tendency to really not have any direct political influence anymore. They're more or less just kind of figureheads, and the real work of governance is done by Parliament. That being said, the royal family is still, of course, very, very famous. I'm sure you all know the stories about, William and Kate Middleton, and then what's his name, Harry and Meghan Markle and all those folks. They're all part of the royal family. And so they're significant people, but they don't have the level of influence that earlier kings and queens of England had. And she served as queen from 1837 to 1901. Okay, that is a very, very long time to serve as queen. And so we're talking about, think about that for a second. 1837 to 1901, that's an extremely long reign. We're talking over 60 years, and 63 years actually. So, a real long time. And so that's why during the 1800s, typically throughout the entire 1800s, we simply refer to that age in Britain as the Victorian period, because it was under Queen Victoria. Okay? Industrial Revolution, first major theme of this unit. Debatably, the Industrial Revolution is the most important development in human history of the last 10,000 years. Okay? It radically alters not only the European economy, but the entire global economy by providing steam power for factory production and transportation developments like railroads. And then, of course, textiles, which is clothing, cloth, being produced in factories, the use of coal for fuel, and then iron, and eventually down the line, steel industries were the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. Now, one of the things that I need to mention to you is that a lot of historians these days look back at the developments economically that have happened since the start of the original Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s, and identified actually not one industrial revolution, but multiple industrial revolutions. That is to say that the first industrial revolution is marked by certain features that the second industrial revolution, which takes place in about the 1860s or 70s, is not characterized by. So to give you just a little bit of comparison right off the bat here to prevent you from becoming confused later on, this unit is focusing pretty exclusively on the original Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution. This one takes place really starting with some of the stuff that we've talked about already in here with the Proto-Industrial Revolution phase. You might remember me using that term, Proto-Industrialism. Whenever we talk about a prototype, we're talking about a mock-up of a design of what a finished product will eventually look like. That's kind of what proto-industry was. It's a mock-up of what the Industrial Revolution would eventually, look like, okay, or like an initial design of the Industrial Revolution. When the Industrial Revolution gets into full swing is about 1830, okay? So from, let's say, about 50 years before 1830, the period from about 1780 to 1830 is this period of proto-industrialization where we're beginning to see changes, significant changes to the economy in Britain. Now, just as a reminder to you, this is happening, these changes to the economy, the Industrial Revolution and proto-industry are happening you know, over the same period of time as our last unit. Okay, you know, think about it. We're kind of talking about some changes in the late early 1800s. That's the period of time that the French Revolution is happening. By the time that we get to 1799, Napoleon is in power. And in the early 1800s, as Britain is waging war against Napoleon, the Industrial Revolution is happening at the same time in Britain. Okay, so it's a pretty amazing little snapshot in history, the early 1800s. Now, to clear up any confusion, the first Industrial Revolution is really focusing on steam power. It focuses on the use of coal. It focuses on the creation of textiles in factories. And then, of course, the use of iron. But when we talk about the second industrial revolution, which happens in like the 1870s, 1880s, which we'll get to in a different unit and won't spend quite as much time on, the second industrial revolution kind of focuses on different things. The second industrial revolution, rather than focusing on iron, it's much more focused on steel production. Rather than being focused on textile factories, they start excuse me, they start focusing on other things: pharmaceuticals, dyes, chemicals, things like that. Also, consumer goods. Okay, the second industrial revolution is very, very heavy on consumer goods, stuff that people buy and use for their own personal use, right? The second industrial revolution, rather than focusing on steam power like the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution focuses on the internal combustion engine and the beginning of the use of petroleum and fossil fuels, right? So, you know, just slightly different focuses between these two different eras in the 1800s. So just talking a little bit about the overview, and you know, just one last thing just to clarify to you. You know, I really can't explain how, when I say debatably the most important development in history, I really cannot understate I cannot understate just how important it is in terms of understanding how different the world is today from how it was before the Industrial Revolution. Okay, let me tell you what I mean. Let me switch back to me for a second. As you look around you, all right, I have a monitor in front of me, and the monitor comes with a remote control. Okay, this remote control is made up of a bunch of different parts. Okay, just little parts. For example, this little battery door here on the back of it. Okay, this battery door is made in a plastics factory. I used to work in a plastics factory that used to make little parts just like this one. And so there's some factory somewhere on the planet where there's a person standing at a plastic press that is churning these parts out all day long. And they load them into a box, they seal the box, they open a new box, and then they start pouring more parts into the new box. And that's their job. That's factory wage labor work, working in an industrial factory that makes plastic parts. And really, there's all sorts of different things. I mean, I've got this little coffee mug here, my phone, a mouse for my, computer, these cables here. All of these items are stuff that's produced in factories, and we are able to purchase these goods for our own personal use, for our own personal enjoyment. Okay, um, you know, it's hard to imagine, really. If you know, going back to, I don't know if you remember in the beginning of the year, one of the things that I try and do is to the extent that I'm able, using my words, get you to time travel a little bit in history and go back and realize just how different the world was 500 years ago. But I really need to further extend that because, you know, in the last 200 years, 220 years, okay, Industrial Revolution has once again completely revolutionized our understanding of how the world works. And humans, you know, there's a lot that can be said about capitalism. I don't know if you guys have been following the news recently, but you know, there was this whole thing about Redditors who have been investing in businesses that big hedge fund companies bet to fail. And when these everyday people started investing in AMC movie theaters and GameStop and other companies like that within the last week, it really did a number on the stock market because these major corporations, banking corporations, that have all this money invested in these other businesses failing, ended up losing a bunch of money when all of a sudden the stocks prices for these failing businesses skyrocketed. Hey, baby Mochi. So, you know, there are a lot of feelings about capitalism because capitalism has at times in history really created a pretty unfair, tilted system where wealth accumulates in just massive quantities at the very top of the you know, of the socioeconomic ladder, and the rest of society is forced to share rather a pittance of wealth amongst them. So for this reason, a lot of people, you know, in the world struggle because of the system of global capitalism. That's just a fact that we have to come to terms with, which is that, you know, there are a lot of folks around the world who will never, ever have the opportunity that you, as a youngster growing up in Eastville, going to this beautiful STEM academy, even though I know that we're online right now, but they'll never have that, you know. That's one of the major concerns about global capitalism is there is a pretty significant divide globally, never mind domestically right here in the United States, but certainly globally, a huge divide between those who have significant amounts of wealth and those who have virtually none. There are 2 billion people on the planet who live on less than $2 a day. Global capitalism, to some extent, has created those conditions. And so that's a valid critique of it. On the other side of it, though, there's not one person listening to me right now in this class who hasn't benefited directly from global capitalism. The fact that your house has heating and air conditioning, the fact that you're able to purchase clothing rather than make it on a loom, for example, okay? The fact that you can go out, buy a bike, buy shoes, food, whatever you need, and you don't have to produce it yourself, is directly as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Virtually everything that you interact with on a daily basis, unless you made it yourself, or it's like a handmade boutique good by some sort of artist or artisan, is a factory made good. Virtually everything. from the rug in the background over here on this side to that air purifier over here to the knob on my front door, okay, to these things over here, to the plastic cover on the wall where the light socket is. You just have to realize every single one of those things is made somewhere in the world in a factory. And it's a pretty amazing thing. You know, it's a truly amazing thing to have such a variety of goods that we can purchase rather cheaply for our own use, you know? And so, you know, global capitalism, are there some downsides to it? Yeah, there's some pretty significant ones, environmental, social, and so on. But there's also some good sides to it, particularly for people like us who are privileged, right? And that's one thing that we always have to keep in mind, is that we're lucky. We're living in one of the wealthiest regions on the planet in Southern California. We live, for many of you, not maybe all of you, but for many of you, you live in very nice homes, in a safe community, and you're able to go to a school and so on and so forth. But because we're so used to that, there is a tendency to forget to appreciate it, you know? But certainly not everybody has the same experience. And so it's always important to remain appreciative and grateful. All right, let me pop it back over to the PowerPoint here. Okay, overview of the Industrial Revolution. So machines began to replace significantly human and animal power in the production and manufacturing of goods. The steam engine for producing textiles in the 1780s, thanks to a guy by the name of James Watt, W-A-T-T, just like watts on a light bulb, which is, by the way, where we get that term, is from James Watt, who produced the steam engine. Now, technically, James Watt didn't invent the steam engine. He invented the improved steam engine, but technically there was already an original steam engine design prior to James Watt's invention. But James Watt's invention was the one that really caused the steam engine to take off. Europe gradually transitioned from an agricultural and commercial society into a modern industrial society. And as late as the 1830s, only a small fraction of British working people were employed in factories. By the mid-19th century, industrialization had spread all across Europe, and the economic changes of the Industrial Revolution did more than any other economic movement to revolutionize life in Europe and just Western civilization as a whole. Not since the development of agriculture, permanent settlement and permanent crop agriculture during the Neolithic times, had there been such a radical change in human society and how people, operate. Roots of the Industrial Revolution. Just to recap some things that we've already learned about. You might remember going back to the Commercial Revolution just after the Columbian Exchange. There was that whole price revolution that was spurred by the growth of Europe and the age of exploration, where European nations began to set up colonies in the New World. And that price revolution stimulated production and the rise of capitalism, where people would begin to use surplus money, excess cash that they had, and invest that into ventures to make a profit. So let's say that there was a monopoly in the, like there was in the Virginia Company, which originally settled in Virginia, okay, for Britain, for England, okay, and England created this monopoly, this private charter of this company called the Virginia Company, which would have the exclusive rights to go and set up a colony overseas for England in North America. And if you had enough wealth, what you would be able to do is take some of that wealth and invest it in the Virginia company. And if they were successful, of course, they would end up making you a whole bunch of money because you have shares in the company. Very similar to the whole stock market thing I was telling you about. You know, let's say there's this brilliant new startup company like there was back about 15 years ago called Tesla, which I wish I would have invested in when it first started, because I could have had no idea that it was going to grow to the level that it did. Okay, if I would have known that Tesla was going to become as big as it became, I would have dumped every last dollar I had into it, because it would have made me a fortune. Okay, this is the same sort of idea. This is how capitalism works. When you have excess money, you take that money and you invest it into various companies that you think are going to have promise to grow and make you a bunch of money. And so, you know, this is very much kind of a new thing for this time. The middle class during the rise of capitalism provided leadership for the economic revolution with these joint stock companies and charter companies like the Virginia Company back in the 15 and 1600s, and a number of others. The British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch West India Company, all of those were these private companies that people from the middle class who had excess wealth could invest in. Scientific revolution also helped usher in capitalism because it produced the first wave of mechanical inventions and technological advances. So before long, by the time that we get to the 1800s, people are purchasing certain things that they never would have been able to own back in an earlier era. In the 15, 16, and 1700s, it would have been exceedingly rare for somebody to, for example, own a clock, even just a wall clock. But by the time that we get into the 1800s and factories start to produce these technological goods in mass numbers, people then are able to, you know, when they're produced in mass numbers, the price goes down because your supply increases. Okay, whenever you have massive supply of something, an overabundance causes the price to fall. And what happens is when the price falls, people can start to afford it. And so people start purchasing consumer goods for their house, such as clocks, furniture, and various other items. Tea sets, kettles, you know, silverware, things that previously only the wealthiest of the wealthy in Europe would have been able to afford because they would have been handmade goods that would have cost a fortune. They're now being produced cheaply by factories and are being made available to wider and wider and wider segments of the population. Okay, so proto-industrialization, we talked about this. This is kind of like the putting out system, cottage industry as it's sometimes called. Each of those terms are somewhat interchangeable with one another. Proto-industry, cottage industry, putting out system. This is when we saw the agricultural revolution rather, begin to really make a significant change in European diets and the economy, and also the production of textiles, which is really the most important factor. So the cottage industry, if you guys don't remember, just to quickly remind you, this is where urban merchant capitalists who you know, they lived in the urban areas. They didn't want to go through the guild systems because the guilds essentially were costly and they were kind of bureaucratic and expensive. And so these merchant capitalists began seeking out other ways of producing, particularly wool thread. Spinning was a big part of this, spinning wool into yarn. But also then just even weaving that yarn into clothing and things like that, or into cloth rather. And so merchant capitalists provided these raw materials to rural families who lived out in the countryside, and they would put these orders out to the countryside, which is where we get the name putting out system, where they would put these orders out to the countryside, and then women looking, in particular women, but also men, but mostly women, looking to supplement their income in these cottages around urban centers in England, would fill these orders and send these orders back to the cities, where the urban merchant would then resell those for a profit. And so wool cloth was the most important part of the proto-industrial cottage industry. But the problems with it, you might remember, is that you would have disputes between cottagers and merchants over the weights of materials and the quality of the cloth. Rural labor was unorganized and difficult to control. Some people took a long time making things. Sometimes people were really quick about making things. Other times people would try and short you, or those kinds of things. And it became very difficult to control the labor. Merchant capitalists in these urban areas began searching for more efficient methods of production. And this resulted in kind of actually creating this brand new idea of the factory. And the factory really, as we think of factories today, did not exist before that time. You had workshops and stuff like that, but you didn't have these big factories with big machines in them powered by, at first streams, but then eventually, like water mills, okay? But then eventually these factories start to be run by coal, by steam engines, so that you don't have to build the factories on a river, okay, on a water supply, because they create a source of power that they don't need water for anymore. They use coal to power the steam engines in the early industrial revolution. So the results of the cottage industry basically is that we see, whereas before the merchant capitalists would send the orders out to the cottages, now what they're doing is they're having these cottagers come into the city to work, to put in a shift at the factory. And the main reason for that is really just supervisory in nature. They want to be able to supervise their workers. They want to make sure that the factories are running as efficiently as possible, and that they are making absolutely as much stuff as they can as quickly as they can make it. Now, the cottage industry flourished first in England. The proto-industrial technology that we learned about prior to Christmas break included things like the flying shuttle here by John Kay. You may remember me showing you some of these things before. The spinning jenny by James Hargreaves. And then Richard Arkwright's famous water frame, which improved thread spinning. And each of these designs of these various instruments, of course, undergo various improvements over time and get larger and even more efficient and faster. So, eventually, too, another aspect of this is that we see so there's a particular thing that happens in America in the late 1700s, and you'll probably hear his name later on in our lecture today. But there's a guy by the name of Eli Whitney, and Eli Whitney created this device called the cotton gin. Now, unfortunately for Eli Whitney, and it's not really his fault per se, but Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin directly contributed to the complete reinvigoration of the use of slave labor in America. See, one of the things that people a lot of times don't recognize about slavery in America is that here in the United States, after we broke away from Britain and declared our independence in 1776, and we fought the American Revolutionary War, even guys like Thomas Jefferson, who himself, he owned slaves, as did a number of the founding fathers, own slaves. Believe it or not, slavery, many of them, including Jefferson, they thought was on its way out. And indeed, slavery had been dying out, particularly in the North. But what happens after the invention of the cotton gin is that there is a brand new crop in cotton that that now, previously to the cotton gin, the reason that they were using wool and not cotton in an earlier time is because cotton, as a product, as a plant, remember that wool comes from animals, so you need a bunch of sheep to grow wool. You know, sheep are expensive. Sheep are, you have to feed them. And of course, you have to let their wool grow. And so it can take a long time. But it was still way, way faster than cotton, because the way that cotton grows in the ground is cotton, there's different kinds of cotton. There's long fiber cotton, and then it's called short stock cotton or short fiber cotton. And short fiber cotton is the good one, but it's also the one that's harder to cultivate. Long fiber cotton tends to not be as high of quality of cotton, even though it's slightly easier to produce. The problem, though, is that short cotton is the one that people would prefer. And when you think about cotton as a fabric, you know, when you're wearing clothing, think about the difference between wearing a cotton shirt versus a wool shirt, okay? A wool shirt is going to be hot. It's going to be not very breathable. Wool, if it gets wet, wool takes a really, really long time to dry. It's itchy. It's uncomfortable. Cotton, on the other hand, is very breathable. It keeps you cool. It dries quickly, relative to wool at least. And just in general, it's far more comfortable. Okay, cotton is a far more preferable product to, or raw material to make clothing out of. But because short stock cotton is so unbelievably difficult to cultivate, let me just show you what I mean, because it's kind of hard to describe. Short fiber cotton images. Okay, it grows like this. Okay, it grows like this. It grows in these little, if you can see here, this is how cotton grows when it blooms. Okay. And let me see if I can make this picture bigger here. Here we go. Okay, this is what it looks like. Now the pod that it grows in, cotton kind of grows in these pods, in these little flower pod things. But these are not soft. These are hard and they're sharp. Okay, I mean, for you kids growing up in Eastvale, all right, where very few of you, I imagine, have ever had to do farming work or manual labor, your fingers would be torn to shreds within minutes of picking cotton, because you have to pick this piece of cotton out of the pod, which is really sharp, but your work isn't done, because inside these little fluffy cotton ball looking things here are a bunch of seeds, and the cotton has a bunch of shards from this hard pod part around it inside the cotton itself. So you have to clean the cotton out. And that was the part that took absolutely forever, okay? It made cotton completely inefficient as a crop to grow, because it was so labor intensive to clean the cotton after you picked it out of this pod here. And Eli Whitney's cotton gin single-handedly reinvigorates the slave trade in America. And that slave trade, when I say slave trade, what I'm saying is internal domestic slave trade inside America. The British outlawed slavery internationally. So the British began using the British Royal Navy in the early 1800s, in 1808, I believe. is the year that the British outlaw the international slave trade. And the British Royal Navy, which is by this point, thanks to Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the one where Horatio Nelson died, after that, the British Royal Navy goes on to become the most powerful navy on the planet. And what they do is they use their navy to go around and crack down on international slave traders who are trading slaves illegally. And it was a very serious crime. If you were caught trading slaves rather, it was punishable by death on sight. Basically, you could be hanged right away. And so it was very, very serious. But inside America, there were a number of slaves that began to be traded domestically between the North and the South, and new planters who lived, further north in Virginia and places like that, relocated further south in the deep South and began creating these massive cotton plantations where the slave trade expanded significantly throughout the next half century, going all the way up to the end of the Civil War in 1865. And so we have to be honest about the other side of the Industrial Revolution, which was that it came on the backs of, in particular, American slaves who, cotton just happens to geographically grow really, really well in the American South. And so very much the entire Industrial Revolution was built on the backs of American slaves, African Americans. And that's very important. I hope that that's something that you keep in mind as we move throughout the rest of this unit. So why England? Why did England industrialize first? Well, they had all the factors of production needed to support the revolution, the Industrial Revolution, that is. And so let's talk about this. What are factors of production? We may have talked about the factors of production before, but I'm going to mention them again to you. There are 3 factors of production that are necessary prerequisites to have before a nation can begin to industrialize. Those 3 factors of production are land, labor, and capital. I need you to commit those to memory: land, labor, and capital. However, it's not enough just to know the factors of production. One also needs to know more specifically, how did Britain use their land? How did Britain use their labor? How did Britain use their capital? You need to have all 3 of those things, but they need to manifest in certain ways for industrialization to take off. So, what do I mean by that? Well, let's start off with the land. Okay, let's just talk about land factors that allowed Britain to industrialize. The first one is that England, just purely geographically, just talking purely about the land, England has some significant land advantages just really by way of luck, okay? It's not that the British were necessarily better than everyone, although if you talk to most British folks, that's what they'll say. There is a degree of British exceptionalism, all right, that we're, you know how British people are. Well, of course I'm British. I'm not European. I'm British, right? I'm English. And so I'm better than everyone else, right? That's a very typical thing of British folks to believe. Anyway, so the way that the British were able to use their land advantages is that, number one, if we take a look at this little map over here, you're going to notice on this little map there's a bunch of waterways, rivers that run through. Now, the most famous river in England is known as the Thames. It looks like Thames, like the Thames River. It's not pronounced Thames, okay? It's pronounced the Thames, okay? The Thames River, okay? And the Thames runs through London, okay? That's probably the most famous river. But there's also other rivers too, the Trent River, the Severn River, the Wye River, and so on. But anyhow, the point being that many of the industrial centers that start popping up across England, you're going to notice they're right along riverways, Okay, Shrewsbury. Now, Manchester is on the coast, so that's also located, or I'm sorry, Liverpool is located along the coast, so that's also located along a waterfront. Manchester is located a little bit further inland. But by the point that Manchester starts to take off, we're seeing railroads that are beginning to connect land urban areas together with water urban areas. Okay, so rivers is a major land factor that connect the place together. Think of rivers almost as like nature's highways. Okay, rivers, except for they're kind of like one directional highways until we get steam engines on boats, steamboats. Okay, for a long time, rivers could only be traveled one direction, the direction that they flow. Okay, because the current of the river was too strong to sail against, because they didn't have steam engines prior to the start of the 1800s. So rivers are one. The other thing is that England is not very mountainous. England is relatively flat, so it made it pretty easy to build railroads on English land. Okay, compare that to Japan, where Japan struggled a little bit more with building railroads, although they did it very quickly, to their credit. But Japan is very, very mountainous. And when you have all those mountains, obviously it's going to be quite difficult to build railroads that connect together different places. The other thing that England had that was a major land advantage is they had vast deposits of natural resources like coal and iron ore. Again, just by luck, okay? Think of it as like, I don't know if anyone plays video games in here, but if you've ever played old games like I play, like Age of Empires 3 or something like that, or like Warcraft 2 or Starcraft or any of those kinds of games, okay? Think of it as like, it's just a random spawn wherever the little gold mine is going to, or wherever your little whatever, gold source or stone source or whatever pops up on the map. Okay, it's just luck. You hope that you spawn somewhere near where there's going to be some resources that you can start mining. Okay, and the English happened to just spawn in the right place. They got lucky because there's all this coal and iron ore deposits in England, and they start mining that. And so, the natural resources that England had were plentiful. And this is another land factor that really allowed England to industrialize. So that pretty well covers the land factors. All right. Let's start talking about some of the labor factors. So as you know, England has a bunch of people. They had been going through for centuries now, going back to the age of exploration, dramatic explosion in population growth. And so because Britain had all of these people, that set alongside the changes of the agricultural revolution of the 1700s, which just directly preceded the cottage industry and the beginnings of industrialization. You might remember that I told you about the enclosure movement, which began to displace a number of rural agricultural peasants across the English countryside. And the reason it displaced them, of course, is because as the enclosure movement set in England, what ended up happening is that large wealthy landowners started purchasing up plots of land nearby. They got rid of common peasant lands. They started instituting harsher laws like the game laws that prevented peasants from being able to hunt. And increasingly, as new inventions started to be made for the farm, they needed fewer people on those farms to manage them, to tend the farms, to work on the farms. And so increasingly peasants got pushed off the farmlands, and those peasants were replaced with the number one cloth manufacturer of this time, which was sheep. Okay, in the agricultural revolution. So sheep started replacing peasants, and you start to see these massive sheep farms where people are growing sheep so that they can get wool and start spinning that into fabric. So because you had this huge population of peasants that started to be displaced, not because they wanted to, okay, but because they had no other option, these peasants start migrating, looking for places where they can survive. Okay, their world, the world that they knew, that their parents knew, that their grandparents knew, that their great grandparents knew, is it's the rug being ripped out from underneath their feet. Things are changing, and the economy is changing, and what that means is that people are forced to change with it. And what ends up happening is these people begin relocating to urban areas to seek out work. They didn't want to. They would have much rather stayed on the farm because it was an easier life. Okay? People who lived and worked as peasants in agricultural times had pretty straightforward lives. They weren't like the American slaves. Okay? They didn't work 14-hour days, 7 days a week. All right? They pretty much did the work that they needed to, and then they kind of hung out the rest of the day. And then there were seasons where they really weren't doing much work at all. So, I mean, they were doing a lot more work comparative to what a lot of modern folks do to tend their houses. But, comparative to the American slaves, it's not like they're just toiling away on the fields all day long. But they will be toiling away in factories all day long, because as you move to urban areas, it is not a nice situation to find yourself in. But some of them just don't have any other choice. If you had other choices, you would have taken them. And people did do that. Even in the early 1800s, we saw a lot of English people and other people across Europe migrating to America to seek out new opportunities where they could continue to live the kinds of lives that they wanted to, living on farms. Okay? Most people really did not want to move to a dirty, claustrophobic, dangerous, dark, dismal environment like a city and take a job in a factory where they're going to be working in miserable conditions for really long hours, 6 days a week. But they had to make money. And one of the changes that we see with the Industrial Revolution that I mentioned to you, and this change started with the Agricultural Revolution, is we're really seeing the biggest takeaway from the agricultural and industrial revolutions is that we move away from what's called a production-based economy, where people living in rural farming areas are making the food that they eat, literally growing the food that they eat, and then preparing it themselves, as well as anything else that they need. Shoes, clothes, you name it, tools, whatever. Increasingly, after the Industrial Revolution, we see a change towards a consumer-based economy, where instead of making the things that you need, excuse me, I've got the hiccups. Instead of making the things that you need, you start purchasing the things that you need. So you buy what you want. And that's very different, right? That's the kind of economy that we live in right now, all right? Where if you need something, it would be foolish for you if you needed a new pair of shoes to make your own. You just go and buy them. You'd have to pay probably a lot more, to make a pair of shoes than you would just to go out and buy a new pair of shoes. So, anyhow, that kind of gives you some example there. So that's land, and now we've covered labor, and now just the last one is capital. So let's talk a little bit about how England began using their capital. Well, here's a what do they call it? Acronym, okay, MAGIC, that hopefully will help you remember some of the factors that England had going for them as to why they were able to industrialize so quickly. So let's talk. We're really focusing mostly on the capital side here, but you'll see a little land and labor in here too. So M, markets abroad. As you guys already know, England had a lot of colonies. All right. England had gone and established colonies all around the world. They had colonies in the Caribbean. They had colonies for a time in North America and in Canada. They had a colony in Australia. They had a colony in England, or excuse me, not in England, in India. They had a colony in, they had several colonies throughout the Pacific and the Atlantic, and you name it, okay? There were a lot of different places that England had colonies, and just as a forewarning, they're going to be developing more, particularly in Africa and in Asia. So, markets abroad. Because of all of these different colonies, remember that, you know, when it comes to raw materials, we are limited to those places on Earth's surface that can provide those things. If you try and grow bananas in England or coconuts in England, you're going to have a very unsuccessful banana and coconut farm because those items just don't grow there. So you need to go to a place where those items are grown to extract them from those places and bring them back to England. And that's precisely what England was doing with their colonies. You can't really grow tea in England. It doesn't grow well in England. You have to go to a more tropical climate to grow tea leaves. And so England would extract tea, for example, from Sri Lanka or Ceylon in India, okay, you know, near India there. And so anyhow, these markets were very advantageous for England because it allowed them to extract a lot of raw materials. And they also had M could also stand for maritime strength to protect them. They had a strong navy. They had a lot of boats, a lot of ships that allowed them not only to ship goods, but to protect those goods. A actually kind of is out of line here, but it's for agricultural revolution. This larger population from increased food supply during the agricultural revolution allowed for this population of England to boom. So they had a growing population which they could use for labor in factories. And as I just mentioned to you on the last slide, that relocation of population to urban centers after the enclosure movement made it so that there were plenty of people seeking out work in England, and those people who sought out work frequently found it working in factories or in mines or working on railroads or you name it. G stands for government protects private property and entrepreneurs. The government of England at this time, of course, is run by Parliament. And the members of Parliament, both in the House of Lords and in the House of Commons, are going to be largely well-to-do gentry type people. And because of the fact that the people who are making the laws in England are also the ones directly profiting from the Industrial Revolution and the growth of industrialism in England, okay, those people are going to begin making laws that will be directly advantageous to their own personal well-being, their own gain, okay? And you might think of that as being a bit corrupt, because after all, these lawmakers should not just be making laws that benefit them, they should be making laws that benefit the entire population. But in this time, remember that England's government is not super democratic, okay? They have a constitutional monarchy, right? They have a constitutional monarchy. They have a quasi-representative government, in the sense that some people have the ability to vote for who serves in Parliament, but not everyone does. Universal male suffrage won't come around for a little while in England. So the number of people who actually have the ability to make decisions about who serves in government and in government what decisions are made is a pretty select, well-to-do, upper middle class bourgeois slash noble segment of the population. People who had huge land holdings, lots and lots of wealth, and they protected the interests of private property as well as the interests of wealthy entrepreneurs who invested in large-scale businesses so that they would be able to grow. So pretty much you have the bourgeoisie making all the decisions in Parliament, and they're going to be making decisions that are for the benefit of the growth of industrialization. The government also supports risk, okay? They want people making investments. The government makes investments in businesses that have a shot at really growing. And so this will also allow for massive growths of markets and industry in England as well. I stands for iron and coal deposits, which I mentioned as land factors on the last slide. And then C stands for capital. Now, capital is just a fancy word for money, but more people in England, because of the growing population, because of the Industrial Revolution to some extent, we see a widening middle class. What in England they used to call the middling sort of people. You weren't a noble, you may not have been super wealthy, but you had a little bit of money. And particularly after the commercialization of goods and people working for wages and stuff, which is so funny because today, if I said to you, how would you like to get a job where somebody pays you to do your work for a day, whatever. Let's say you can get a job at whatever, a restaurant or a store or something like that. You're hoping that they're going to pay you money, right? We seek out wage labor these days. What's so funny about that is wage labor back in the early industrialization times was seen as basically the next step just barely above slavery, because it was a miserable life. People didn't want to do it, and you became very vulnerable. A lot of the working class population of England became very vulnerable in the early days of Industrial Revolution because of how miserable their living and working conditions were. But after we see the commercialization of goods and people's wages start to rise a little bit, that means that people had excess cash to be able to go out and buy stuff that they wanted or that they needed. And also, as people, particularly the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, these people were willing to make risky investments in businesses, startup businesses that had new ideas. Think of it as being very similar. If you've ever watched the show, what's the name of that stupid show with I can see his face. Mark Cuban. It's the show where they pitch an idea to the sharks. Shark Tank? Is that the name of it? The Sharks. You guys ever seen the movie Shark Tank? Kind of similar to that. Think about what's happening in that show. You have these 5 wealthy business people who have just tons and tons and tons of money. And people go on the show Shark Tank and they pitch their business idea, which could be a new product or a new service, and they pitch their idea to the sharks, and the sharks will either say, this, that, the other, for that reason, I'm out, or they'll say, I like this idea, and they negotiate a business deal. This is called entrepreneurship. The entrepreneurs are the sharks. Okay, they are investing their money into these startup businesses that they believe has a chance to grow. But they're not doing it out of the kindness of their own heart. They're not just giving money away to people to say, here's $2 million, have a nice day, good luck with your business. No. What they usually do is they arrange a deal where if the sharks invest X amount of dollars into these new businesses, what they will then do is they will ask for, in exchange from those business, part ownership of that business. So maybe they own 33% of the business, or maybe they own half of the business, or whatever it is. But the reason that these startup people with these new ideas are willing to go for that deal is because it's the one thing that they need is more capital, more money, to be able to set up production costs or marketing costs or labor costs or whatever costs are associated with their business. And so they're willing to give up part of their ownership of their business in exchange for a huge cash flow from the sharks who are looking to, over time, make a whole lot of money from these companies that they are investing their own cash into. And this is how capitalism works. All right. Also, England had a national bank, and the national bank was also willing in England at this time to give out loans to businesses for the purposes of seeing British industries grow. So, England became the first country to industrialize, and it began in the 1780s, and it wasn't really complete until the 1830s at the very earliest. It had no impact on the continent until after the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon was stirring up too much controversy in continental Europe for the Industrial Revolution to blossom there at the same time that it is in England. Not to mention, the English had a vested interest in not allowing the technologies that were allowing them to grow to reach the continent. They wanted to protect the advantages that they had and kind of keep their developments a secret so that they would, have the upper hand globally in terms of industrialization. Economic and social factors. We talked about land and geography. They had geographic isolation. Just the mere fact that England is an island was a huge factor in what allowed them to industrialize first, because it offered continental protection against Napoleonic invasions, which were going on at that time. They had a great supply of coal and iron, as I've now mentioned. They had waterways, which offered a source of power, and navigable transport for trade and communication. And then you also had the Industrial Revolution growing out of England's expanding role in the Atlantic economy with the growth of the Royal Navy and the development of many ports, which provided protection from foreign invasion and aided in protecting Britain's commercial empire globally. The agricultural revolution was also vital to the Industrial Revolution. They had a huge supply of cheap and abundant labor that emerged as the enclosure movement forced many of those landless farmers to move into urban centers to seek out work. The revolution in agriculture also made it possible for fewer farmers to feed larger numbers of people. So the farms themselves became more efficient because they're producing more, but they have fewer people working on them thanks to advancements in new tools and machinery that they're using on the farms. More people were freed up to work in factories or in the distribution of other goods and services, so people started moving around England in search of either opportunities to purchase land, which were not very widespread, or other forms of employment, namely in urban areas, particularly in factories by the time that we get to the 1830s. Large supplies of capital were available due to over 2 centuries of profitable commercial activity. England avoided many, many costly wars thanks to this. They were able to emerge victorious in the 7 Years' War. Not so much in the American Revolution, but definitely in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, England comes out on top. And it's in no small part due to the fact that the English National Bank had huge amounts of capital, okay, from all of this commercial trading activity that they had been engaged in going back to the 1600s. British merchants and gentry had prospered during many of these wars with Napoleon on the continent. The Bank of England, which had been established going all the way back to 1694, was the central bank. They also developed things like insurance companies, which provided some degree of protection from commercial failure in case a ship sank or you lost a load of supplies from your ships because of pirates or something like that. Okay, so we start to see the emergence of insurance companies. And then new inventions. Thanks to entrepreneurs, a person who takes on the risks of running a business, we see new inventions like Watt's steam engine come about. Watt was only able to go about improving the design of the steam engine thanks to the investment from a wealthy entrepreneur, just like Mark Cuban on Shark Tank. Okay, and this created a fast and efficient power source compared to everything that they had before. Water transportation started to make use of the new steam engine because now they add steam engines to boats, and this makes immediately transportation on riverways bidirectional, two-way transportation. So now you can go with the direction of the river as you always used to be able to, but now with steamboats you can sail against the direction of the river. And this, of course, opens up new opportunities for Britain to begin establishing colonies in places where heretofore they had never been able to explore. For example, the continent of Africa. The continent of Africa was extremely difficult for English explorers to penetrate into because the riverways flowed against the direction of going inland. And so they struggled to uncover the vast interior of Africa because, number one, you have a whole bunch of people who live in Africa who didn't want the British coming in there, but number two, Africa is a very difficult place terrain-wise, climate-wise, and so on. You've got all different diseases and so on and so forth that made going to Africa an absolute death trap. But with the new invention of water transportation and how quickly they're now able to sail up and down rivers, this leads to Britain further encroaching into the interior of Africa, and they end up establishing a whole lot of colonies there. So entrepreneurs are a class of inventive, highly motivated people who possess the technological skill and were willing to take risks on risky business investments. And a lot of the people who made up this class of entrepreneurs were young men from the gentry who took up careers in business. And the middle class found themselves increasingly able to rise into the nobility from the wealth that they created in business during their times as young entrepreneurs. And beyond that, of course, in England, which had been Protestant for a very long time, going back to Henry VIII, the English sentiment of Protestant work ethic definitely contributed to that as well. The whole idea that if you are successful in business and you are wealthy and working hard, God rewards people who work hard, and the sign of your increased wealth is a sign of God's approval of you and the way that you're living your life. So this was another spirit that helped to engender this class of entrepreneurs, both in Britain, but actually in some sense even more so in America, because Britain, by the time we get to the 1800s, they're not super religious the way they used to be back in the 15 and 1600s. We're seeing secularism really very much kind of take hold in Britain by this point, thanks to the Enlightenment and so on. But particularly in America, which industrializes just about the same time that England does, the Protestant work ethic was a major factor in the industrialization of America, no doubt about it. Anyhow, folks, that will bring me to the end of my lecture. So thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you back on Friday. I've already put up the questions for Chapter 20. That'll be due on Friday morning. and we'll pick it up with the Industrial Revolution then. Have a great rest of your day.